A homeowner in rural Iowa stepped onto their back porch at dusk and saw something standing at the fence line of their property. It was not a dog. It was not a bear. It stood upright on two legs with broad shoulders and a canine head, and it was watching the house. They grabbed their phone and started recording. What they captured has since become one of the most debated pieces of Dogman footage to surface in recent years. The figure stands motionless at first, partially turned away, looking around as if inspecting. Then it turns. It faces the camera directly, and for several frames, you can see the full outline of its body. Thick, dark fur, muscular legs planted wide, a broad chest tapering to a narrow waist, and a head that is unmistakably canine, with a pronounced snout and pointed ears set high on the skull. The footage lasts only seconds. The dogman holds its position by the fence, staring toward the camera with what witnesses often describe as an unsettling awareness, not the blank gaze of a startled animal, but the focused attention of something that knows it is being observed and is deciding what to do about it. Then the clip ends. No context was given beyond a title that read "Dogman Spotted," watching from an Iowa field at dusk. No location beyond the state, no date beyond the year, no follow-up interview, no name attached to the account. Just the footage and the flat winter light of an Iowa evening falling across an open field with mountains visible in the distance. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. I have spent a long time looking at this footage, frame by frame, zoomed in, brightness adjusted, contrast pulled up. And I want to be honest with you about what I see. The proportions are wrong for a person in a suit. The legs are too thick and too short relative to the torso. The way the dogman shifts its weight when it turns to face the camera is fluid in a way that does not match the stiff mechanical movement you typically see in hoaxed costume footage. There is no visible seam line, no bunching of fabric at the joints, no mask edge around the neck. The fur moves with the body. The head sits on the shoulders in a way that suggests a natural skeletal structure rather than a rubber prosthetic mounted on top of a human skull. But I also want to be fair. The footage is shot at a distance. The resolution is not high enough to make definitive claims. The lighting is that flat gray tone you get in the Midwest during late autumn or early spring when the sun sits low and washes everything in a dull, amber haze. You cannot see the eyes clearly. You cannot make out fine details of the face. What you can see is the silhouette, and that silhouette is deeply unsettling because it does not match anything that should be standing upright in an Iowa field at dusk. Now here is what makes this footage significant to me. It is not the clip itself. Isolated footage can always be debated and dismissed. What makes it significant is that Iowa has a documented history of dogman encounters going back decades, and the behavior shown in this footage matches those accounts with uncomfortable precision. The dogman is not charging. It is not fleeing. It is standing at the boundary of a property and watching. That specific behavior, the watching, the standing, at fence lines and tree lines and property edges, comes up again and again in Iowa dogman reports. And the two most detailed accounts I have found paint a picture that turns this footage from a curiosity into something that demands serious attention. The first account comes from Cedar Falls in the northeastern part of the state. It was March of 1981. The witness was a college athlete attending Iowa State University on a track and field scholarship. He had traveled back to his hometown of Cedar Falls for a meet at the University of Northern Iowa, and his girlfriend had driven up from Ames to watch him compete. His parents were out of town for the weekend, and rather than make the long drive back that night, they decided to stay at the family home. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision. They had no reason to think anything would go wrong. His parents had recently moved to a subdivision called Buck Ridge, several miles northwest of Cedar Falls. The house sat on an acre of property on the eastern side of the development. The backyard faced east toward a set of woods that ran along the top of a ridge and continued down to the banks of the West Fork of the Cedar River. On the north side of the property, there was a thin stand of trees along the border, and tucked into the northwest corner of that tree line sat a small horse barn. The property was rural enough that the nearest neighbors were not close, and the tree coverage on 3 sides meant that once the sun went down, the darkness beyond the reach of the house lights was absolute. They pulled into the driveway around 11 at night. March in northeastern Iowa is a particular kind of cold. The snow is gone, but the warmth has not arrived yet. The trees are bare. The ground is that flat brown color that looks dead under headlights. There is no cover anywhere, no leaves on the branches, no tall grass in the fields, no green of any kind to soften the landscape. Everything is exposed and open and stripped down to its bones. And when the sun goes down in a place like that, the darkness does not creep in gradually the way it does in summer. It drops like a curtain. One moment there is gray light on the horizon, and the next moment there is nothing beyond the reach of whatever bulb you have burning. The plan was simple. He would grab the spare key his parents kept hidden in the garage. They would let themselves in, sleep, and head back to Ames in the morning. He opened the garage door and started looking through the shoebox where the key was supposed to be. It was not there. He checked other boxes, other shelves, other hiding spots. Nothing. He went around to the back of the house and tried to work a window screen loose to get in that way, but the screens were set tight and he could not remove them without bending the frames. The back of the house faced those woods on the ridge, and standing there alone in the dark trying to pry at window frames was not an experience he wanted to prolong. He went back to the garage and started going through more boxes, the garage door still open behind them, the outdoor light casting a pool of illumination across the driveway and the car parked in it. Beyond that pool, the property fell away into pure darkness on 3 sides. That was when he heard the growling. It came from directly behind him, from the direction of that thin stand of trees on the north edge of the property. The first time he heard it, he thought he was imagining things. The second time it came louder, and it was unmistakable. His girlfriend was standing right behind him, and she had heard it too. She was already looking over her shoulder toward the sound. He grabbed a claw hammer from the workbench and walked out of the garage onto the driveway, fully expecting to confront a neighbor's dog that had wandered onto the property. The growling was deep and guttural, continuous and unbroken, and it was coming from the exact line where the garage light ended and the darkness of the tree line began. The dogman was roughly 30 feet away. It was close enough that the sound vibrated in his chest, but far enough into the shadow that he could not see it. He started walking up the driveway, which curved to the left, and the dogman moved with him. It paralleled his steps exactly, matching his pace, staying just inside the darkness. Every step he took, the dogman took one too. The growl never stopped. It was tracking him. He walked until he was nearly out of the reach of the garage light. He was now almost directly across from the horse barn on the northwest corner of the property. The darkness ahead was total. The dogman was still 30 feet away, still hidden, still growling. He made a decision that he would later describe as the kind of choice you make when adrenaline overrides every rational thought in your head. He raised the hammer, turned toward the sound, and charged straight at it, screaming. What happened next stopped him mid-stride. The dogman let out a roar that he later compared to the sound of a male lion. It was not a bark. It was not a howl. It was a full-throated roar that came from a chest cavity far larger than any dog could possess, and it sounded like it originated from a height well above his own 6 feet and 4 inches. The sheer volume and depth of it hit him like a physical force. He felt it in his ribcage. He felt it in the soles of his feet through the concrete of the driveway. The air itself seemed to compress around him as if the sound had weight and mass of its own. Every instinct he had flipped from aggression to survival in an instant. He knew with absolute certainty that whatever was standing in that darkness was not a dog of any breed or size. It was something else entirely, something that outmatched him in every way that mattered. The hammer in his hand felt like a toy. His body felt small in a way that had nothing to do with his actual size. He was standing in front of something that could end him, and they both knew it. He turned and yelled for his girlfriend to get in the car. He backed down the driveway slowly, keeping his eyes on the tree line, and the dogman paralleled him again, matching his retreat step for step, growling the entire way. He reached the car, slid into the driver's seat still facing the darkness, and backed down the driveway. As they passed the stand of trees, he angled his headlights toward it, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had been tracking him. He saw nothing. No movement, no shadow, no eyeshine. The Dogman had either retreated deeper into the trees or had positioned itself in a way that avoided the light entirely. They did not go back to the house that night. They drove to a motel north of Cedar Falls and sat in the room with the lights on, trying to process what had just happened. Neither of them slept. He sat on the edge of the bed, running through every explanation he could think of. A feral dog, an escaped animal from a farm, a person playing a prank. None of them held up. The growl had been sustained for minutes, tracking him across the length of the driveway without breaking or changing in a way that suggested a moving animal adjusting its position. It had been a continuous wall of sound that stayed locked at the same distance no matter which direction he moved. And the roar. There was no version of reality in which a dog or a person produced that roar. He was a Division I athlete, 6'4", over 200 pounds, running on pure adrenaline with a weapon in his hand, and that roar had stopped him cold. Whatever made that sound was not afraid of him. It was not threatened by him. It had simply been telling him where the line was. In the morning, they returned to close the garage door and shut off the lights. The daylight changed the property completely. The thin stand of trees on the north side looked small and manageable, just a few dozen trunks with bare branches reaching up against a gray sky. The horse barn sat quiet in the corner. There were no tracks that he noticed, no damage, no sign that anything had been there at all. But there was one detail about the property that he did not learn until years later, and it changed the way he understood that night entirely. His mother used to keep a small garden near the horse barn on the northwest corner, right next to where the Dogman had been standing. While working the soil, she regularly found arrowheads and other Native American artifacts. The property sat on or near what had once been indigenous land with significant cultural activity. When the witness later learned about the connections between Dogman sightings and Native American sacred sites, the location of their encounter took on a weight that simple coincidence could not explain. The Dogman had not been wandering through the neighborhood. It had been stationed at a specific spot on a specific piece of land that had a history reaching back centuries before the subdivision was built on top of it. He did not know what a Dogman was in 1981. The term barely existed in popular culture. The Michigan Dogman song that brought the phenomenon to mainstream attention would not be released until 1987, 6 years after his encounter. The Beast of Bray Road sightings in Wisconsin would not make headlines until the early 1990s. He had no framework for what he experienced that night, no community of witnesses to compare notes with, no internet database to search. He carried the encounter in silence for years, turning it over in his mind, trying and failing to find a conventional explanation. It was only decades later, when information about Dogman sightings became widely available, that he recognized his experience for what it was. And by then he had learned that he was not the only person in Iowa who had come face to face with something that should not exist. The second account comes from Linn County in the eastern part of the state. The witness was a deputy sheriff working patrol on a July night. He was assigned to the Highway 13 and Highway 30 corridors, but that particular evening he had been pulled into a search operation. A teenager had been swept into a storm drain that emptied into Cedar Lake near the Quaker Oats plant. The area was urban, well-trafficked, bordered by a public park. It was not the kind of place where you expect to encounter anything more dangerous than a stray dog or a belligerent drunk. The search had been going on for hours, and the local police department had requested county assistance. The deputy parked his cruiser at an electric company storage yard adjacent to the search area. The yard had a tall fence, maybe 10 feet high, that ran parallel to a paved bike trail. On the other side of the trail was a large concrete spillway built to manage floodwater. Beyond that, railroad tracks and then timber. Dense timber that pressed right up against the urban edge of the city like a wall. He arrived just before midnight. The area was dark despite being technically within city limits. The storage yard lights were minimal. The bike trail had no illumination. The only light came from his cruiser and whatever ambient glow carried from the streets further away. July in Iowa means thick air and mosquitoes, and the smell of vegetation growing so fast you can almost hear it. The night was warm and heavy and the kind of dark that sits on your skin. He was a big man, 6'4", 280 pounds. He was armed and trained and wearing a full uniform with a police radio on his belt. He was not the kind of person who spooked easily. He had worked third shift patrol for years, and he knew what the night sounded like in that part of the county. He knew the difference between the sound of a raccoon going through a dumpster and the sound of a person trying to be quiet. He knew the way deer moved through brush and the way coyotes yipped at the edge of residential areas. He had a catalog of night sounds built up over thousands of hours of solo patrol work. What he heard next was not in that catalog. He was standing near his vehicle, monitoring his radio, when he heard something on the other side of the tracks, a snorting sound, almost like heavy sniffing, rhythmic and deliberate. He turned toward it, and the first thing he saw were the eyes. They were reflecting his light back at him with a dull red glow, and they were positioned at a height that immediately told him this was not a dog or a coyote. The eyes were nearly level with his own, and he was 6 feet 4 inches tall. Whatever was looking at him was standing upright. He turned his flashlight directly toward the source, and what he saw is something he has carried with him every day since. The Dogman was at least 8 feet tall. He estimated its weight at over 400 pounds, based on the sheer mass of what he was looking at. It had pointed ears set high on its head. It had a long muzzle, and it was looking directly into his face with an expression that he described not as aggression or fear, but as something closer to appraisal, as if the Dogman was measuring him, cataloging him, deciding whether he was a threat or simply irrelevant. The Dogman held that eye contact for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and bolted into the timber with a speed that seemed impossible for something that large. The deputy stood there in the dark with his Glock 40 in his hand, a round chambered and a full magazine, and he said that in that moment it did not feel like enough firepower. He had spent years in law enforcement. He had handled armed suspects, domestic violence calls, high-speed pursuits. None of it had prepared him for the primal terror of standing alone in the dark while something 8 feet tall with a canine face stared him down from 30 yards away. He backed toward his cruiser with his weapon drawn. He put the 10-foot fence of the storage yard at his back and moved along it toward his vehicle, scanning the tree line with every step. The timber where the Dogman had disappeared was maybe 60 yards away, and in the darkness it could have been 6 feet or 600. He did not holster his weapon until he was inside the cruiser with the doors locked and the engine running. He did not holster it until he was out of the park entirely. He drove back to the main roads where the streetlights burned and the world made sense again, and he sat in his cruiser under an overpass and let his hands shake for 5 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. He never filed an official report. He never told his fellow deputies. He never mentioned it to his supervisor or his family or anyone connected to his professional life. He never put his name on any written account. He carried it in silence for years, knowing exactly what would happen to his career and his credibility if he told anyone in law enforcement that he had seen a Dogman while on duty in Linn County, Iowa. Think about that for a moment. A deputy sheriff, a man trained to observe and report, a man whose entire professional identity was built on being a credible witness, saw something that shook him to his core, and his first response was to bury it completely. Not because he doubted what he saw, but because he knew the system he worked in could not accommodate what he saw. The witness made this clear in his account. There would never be an official statement with his name on it. He knew what he saw. He knew the Dogman knew he was there, and he knew that no one with a badge and a career to protect would ever admit to seeing something like that. That silence is not evidence of fabrication. It is evidence of how seriously he took what happened. What strikes me about these two accounts is not just the encounters themselves. It is the pattern. Both witnesses describe a Dogman that was watching them, not attacking, not running, watching. The Cedar Falls Dogman stood at the tree line and tracked a man up and down his own driveway, matching his pace, maintaining a fixed distance, never closing in but never backing off. The Linn County Dogman stood across the tracks and held eye contact with an armed law enforcement officer before choosing to leave on its own terms. In both cases, the Dogman controlled the encounter. It decided how close to get. It decided when to reveal itself. It decided when to end the interaction. The humans involved were not hunters who had stumbled onto prey. They were subjects under observation. And that brings us back to the footage from the Iowa field. Look at it again. The Dogman is standing at a fence line. It is not crouched. It is not hiding, in a posture that suggests it has been there for a while. It is oriented toward the house. When it turns to face the camera, it does not flee. It does not charge. It stands there, legs spread, weight balanced, and it looks. That is the behavior. That is the pattern. The Dogman watches. Now I want to take a step back and put the Iowa sightings into a broader context because these encounters do not exist in isolation. Iowa sits in the heart of the American Midwest, bordered by Wisconsin to the northeast and Michigan across the lake. Those two states are the epicenter of documented Dogman activity in the United States, and the corridor that connects them runs directly through Iowa. The first widely recognized Dogman sighting in modern history occurred in 1887 in Wexford County, Michigan. Two lumberjacks reported seeing a creature with the body of a man and the head of a dog standing approximately 7 feet tall in the forest near their logging camp. The account was dismissed as a tall tale and largely forgotten for 100 years, until a radio DJ named Steve Cook wrote a song about it in 1987 as an April Fool's prank. Cook composed the song on a keyboard, pulled details from a handful of historical accounts he thought he was embellishing, and aired it on his Traverse City station expecting laughs. The song was supposed to be a joke. It was based entirely on Cook's imagination, or so he thought. After the song aired, the phone lines at the radio station lit up with callers who said they had seen the same thing. Not one or two callers, dozens. People who had kept their encounters secret for years, sometimes decades, suddenly had a name for what they had seen, and a public forum to talk about it. Cook later said he was stunned by the response. He had expected people to laugh. Instead, they called in shaking, some of them in tears, describing encounters that matched the details in his song with a precision that made his skin crawl. These were not people looking for attention. They were people who had been carrying a burden in silence and had just heard someone else describe it on the radio. The Michigan Dogman went from campfire legend to genuine phenomenon overnight. Cook sold cassettes of the song for $4 and donated the proceeds to an animal shelter. Over the following years, he received more than 100 reports from people claiming to have seen the creature. He never fully reconciled the fact that his April Fool's joke had tapped into something real. In Wisconsin, a parallel tradition had been developing around a stretch of rural road near the town of Elkhorn. A creature that came to be known as the Beast of Bray Road was first reported in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Witnesses described a large canine figure that walked upright, had thick dark fur, and was seen stalking along roadsides, crossing fields, and in at least one case approaching a parked vehicle. One encounter involved a retired law enforcement officer named Laura Love, who was a passenger in a car on Highway US 31 near Shelby, Michigan, when the headlights illuminated a massive figure crossing the road. She described it as muscular and canine, moving on 2 legs with a confidence that no normal animal displayed. She was a trained observer who had spent her career assessing situations under pressure, and she said without hesitation that what she saw was not a dog, not a wolf, not a bear, and not a person in a costume. It was a Dogman. The descriptions from Wisconsin were nearly identical to the Michigan accounts, despite the witnesses having no contact with each other and no awareness of the Michigan reports. The Beast of Bray Road was investigated extensively by journalist Linda Godfrey, whose research established that the sightings were coming from credible witnesses, including law enforcement officers, military veterans, and long-time rural residents with extensive knowledge of local wildlife. Godfrey documented dozens of encounters and found the same behavioral patterns appearing across all of them. The Dogman appeared at the edges of human spaces. It watched before it moved. It showed awareness of being observed. And it left on its own terms, never fleeing in panic but withdrawing with the deliberate pace of something that had no natural predator to fear. The connection between these sightings and Native American oral traditions is something that comes up repeatedly in the research, and it is something I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The Odawa tribes who lived in the areas around Lake Michigan described wolf-like beings that walked on two legs and stalked the forests long before European settlement. These were not casual mentions in folklore. They were specific warnings about specific places and specific creatures that were treated with deadly seriousness by people who lived in intimate daily contact with the natural world and knew the difference between a large wolf and something that was not a wolf at all. The Cedar Falls witness noted that his mother found Native American arrowheads and artifacts in the soil near the exact spot where the Dogman had been standing. This detail appears over and over in Dogman encounter reports across the Midwest. Sightings cluster around areas with documented indigenous cultural significance. Burial mounds, ceremonial sites, ancient village locations, and traditional hunting grounds all show elevated rates of Dogman activity compared to surrounding areas. One of the earliest and most famous Dogman encounters on record took place at the St. Coletta Convent in Racine, Wisconsin in 1936, where a night watchman named Mark Shackleman saw a canine creature kneeling and scratching at an indigenous burial mound on the convent grounds. The Dogman fled when Shackleman approached, but he found footprints and claw marks in the dirt around the mound. Two of the fingers appeared withered based on the markings in the soil. He returned the following night for his scheduled shift and found the Dogman at the same spot, scratching at the same mound. This time, it didn't run. It stood up to its full height of 6 feet, turned, and made direct eye contact with the watchman. Shackleman held his ground and prayed. The Dogman held its gaze for a long moment, and then it spoke a single word, Gadara. Shackleman had no idea what the word meant. He simply maintained eye contact, turned slowly, and walked away without running. The burial mound was the focal point of both encounters. The Dogman was not passing through. It was not hunting. It was not lost. It was there for the mound, specifically, and it returned to the same exact spot on consecutive nights with a purpose that suggested something far more deliberate than animal behavior. This pattern suggests something that the skeptics rarely address. If Dogman sightings were the product of mass hysteria or misidentification of known animals, you would expect them to be randomly distributed across the landscape. People see bears and wolves and large dogs everywhere. Misidentification should not cluster around culturally significant indigenous sites with any statistical regularity, but it does. And the indigenous oral traditions that describe these creatures predate European contact by centuries, which means the pattern was established long before anyone had heard of the Michigan Dogman or the Beast of Bray Road, or had any cultural template to project onto their experiences. Iowa has its own indigenous history that is deep and complex. The state takes its name from the Iowa people who lived there for centuries before European colonization. The Meskwaki, the Sauk, the Sioux, and dozens of other nations had territories that overlapped with what is now Iowa. The river systems that run through the state, the Cedar River, the Iowa River, the Des Moines River, were not just transportation routes. They were cultural arteries along which communities built their lives, conducted their ceremonies, and buried their dead. The bluffs and ridges that overlook these rivers were sacred spaces. The effigy mounds in the northeastern part of the state are among the most significant indigenous ceremonial sites in North America. Some of them are shaped like animals. Some are shaped like things that do not map neatly onto any known species. The Cedar Falls encounter happened on a ridge overlooking the West Fork of the Cedar River. The Linn County encounter happened near Cedar Lake and the Cedar River spillway system. Both locations sit within the river corridor network that formed the backbone of indigenous life in Iowa for thousands of years. The Dogman in the Iowa field footage stands in open grassland with mountains visible in the background, the kind of transitional landscape between river bottom and high ground that indigenous peoples used as hunting territory, travel routes, and spiritual gathering places. These are not random locations. They are the same places that have been significant to the beings who lived on this land long before any Europeans set foot in Iowa. The idea that something might be connected to those places, something that predates the farms and the subdivisions and the electric company storage yards, is not as far-fetched as the modern mind wants it to be. We have built our world on top of a world that was already occupied. We have paved over trails that were walked for millennia and built houses on ground that held ceremonies we cannot imagine. And the things that were part of that older world did not necessarily leave when we arrived. Some of them may have simply stepped back to the tree line and waited. I want to talk about the behavior again, because I think it is the key to understanding what we are looking at in that footage. Across hundreds of documented Dogman encounters spanning more than a century of reports, certain behavioral patterns repeat with a consistency that is hard to explain through random fabrication or misidentification. The Dogman watches. It positions itself at boundaries, at the edges of properties, at tree lines and fence lines, and the margins where human space meets wild space. It does not typically attack unprovoked. It does not typically flee immediately when discovered. It holds its ground, it makes eye contact, and then it leaves on its own terms. This is not the behavior of a predator that has been caught off guard. This is surveillance. This is a pattern of deliberate observation carried out by something with enough intelligence to choose its position, maintain its distance, and control the duration and intensity of the encounter. When the Cedar Falls Dogman matched the witness's pace step for step up the driveway, it was demonstrating spatial awareness and responsive movement that goes far beyond the capabilities of any known canine species. Dogs do not parallel humans in darkness while maintaining a precise fixed distance. Wolves do not track individual people along the boundary of a residential lot. The Dogman was not reacting to the witness, it was managing the encounter. And that level of behavioral complexity suggests a cognitive capacity that puts whatever we are dealing with in a category well beyond any animal currently recognized by science. The Cedar Falls Dogman paralleled a man up his own driveway, maintaining exactly 30 feet of distance, never closing in, never backing away, as if it were conducting a patrol route along the boundary of its territory. The Linn County Dogman stood across an open space from an armed officer, held eye contact, and then chose to leave at a speed that made pursuit impossible. The Dogman in the Iowa field footage stands at a fence with one hand on the rail, facing the house, turning to acknowledge the camera but making no move to approach or retreat. In all three cases, the Dogman is in control. It has chosen to be visible. It has chosen to be seen. And the implicit message in that choice is one that every witness seems to receive, and none of them can articulate fully. The Dogman is letting you know that it is there, and that it has been there longer than you have. There is a detail from the Linn County encounter that I keep coming back to. The deputy described the Dogman's eyes as glowing a dull red, not the bright green or yellow eyeshine you get from deer or coyotes or raccoons when light hits their tapetum lucidum. A dull red. That specific eye color appears in Dogman reports from across the country with a frequency that is statistically notable. Michigan reports describe it. Wisconsin reports describe it. Accounts from Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania describe it. If these sightings were all misidentifications of known animals, the eyeshine color should vary randomly based on the species being misidentified. Instead, it clusters around a specific hue that does not match any known North American predator. The deputy also estimated the Dogman at 8 feet tall and over 400 pounds. Those dimensions are consistent with the upper range of reported Dogman sizes across the Midwest. Most accounts place the Dogman between 6 and 8 feet in height when standing upright, with an estimated weight between 300 and 500 pounds. For comparison, the largest recorded gray wolf in North America weighed approximately 175 pounds and stood about 3 feet tall at the shoulder. Even on its hind legs, a wolf of that size would not reach 5 feet. The largest recorded black bear in Iowa weighed around 500 pounds but stood only about 5 feet tall when upright, and has a body shape that is completely different from what witnesses describe. Bears are round and heavy through the middle. Dogman witnesses consistently describe a build that is broad through the shoulders and chest, but narrow at the waist, more like an athletic human frame covered in fur than the barrel shape of a bear. I want to address the skeptical explanations directly because they deserve consideration. Could the Cedar Falls encounter have been a large dog? The witness was a trained athlete with excellent reflexes and above-average physical awareness. He heard the growling at close range for an extended period, and he was familiar with what dogs sound like. He dismissed the dog explanation himself before the encounter even escalated. No domestic dog and no known wild canine species produces a roar comparable to a male lion, and no known canine stands taller than 6'4" on its hind legs. The dog explanation fails on multiple criteria. Could the Linn County encounter have been a bear? Black bears are present in Iowa but rare, and their populations in 2001 were even more sparse than today. Bears do not typically stand motionless and make prolonged eye contact with humans. They do not have pointed ears, long muzzles, or eyes that reflect red. The deputy was a trained observer whose career depended on accurately assessing situations and identifying threats. He knew what bears looked like. He knew what dogs looked like. What he saw matched neither. Could the footage from the field be a person in a costume? It could be. Any piece of footage can potentially be fabricated, but the proportions, the movement, the posture, and the behavioral pattern all argue against the simple costume explanation. Modern creature suits used in professional film productions are impressive at close range, but they have limitations that become apparent in sustained footage. The joints move wrong. The weight distribution is off. The person inside cannot avoid the mechanical quality of movement that comes from having a human skeleton inside a non-human shell. The figure in this footage moves with a natural fluidity that is difficult to replicate with prosthetics and padding. And there is the broader question that the skeptical framework struggles to answer. If every Dogman sighting is a hoax or a misidentification, why do the reports cluster geographically along the Great Lakes corridor and the Midwest river systems? Why do they cluster around indigenous cultural sites? Why do witnesses separated by decades and hundreds of miles describe the same physical characteristics, the same behavioral patterns, and the same emotional response? Why did dozens of people call a Michigan radio station in 1987 to report encounters they had never told anyone about? Encounters that predated the song that supposedly started the legend. The hoax explanation requires us to believe that hundreds of people across multiple states over more than a century have independently fabricated the same lie with the same specific details. That is a harder thing to believe than the alternative. I am not going to tell you that the footage from the Iowa field is definitive proof that Dogman exists. No single piece of evidence can carry that weight. What I'm going to tell you is that when you place this footage alongside the documented encounters from Cedar Falls and Linn County, alongside the broader pattern of Midwest Dogman sightings, alongside the indigenous oral traditions that describe these beings going back centuries, alongside the behavioral consistency across hundreds of independent reports, the picture that emerges is not one that can be easily dismissed. Something is out there in the fields and forests and river corridors of Iowa. Something that stands upright and watches from the edges of human spaces with an intelligence that witnesses find more disturbing than any physical threat. The Dogman in the Iowa footage stands at the fence and looks toward the house. It does not hide. It does not run. It stands there in the fading light of a Midwestern dusk with the confidence of something that knows this land better than the people who built the fence. The mountains in the background stretch away toward the horizon. The field is open and flat, offering no cover, no concealment, no reason for anything to be standing at that fence unless it chose to be there. And the Dogman chose to be there. Just as the Dogman in Cedar Falls chose to stand in the tree line by the horse barn, where arrowheads lay buried in the soil. Just as the Dogman in Linn County chose to stand across the tracks from an armed deputy and hold his gaze until it was ready to leave. The pattern is the proof, not any single sighting, not any single piece of footage, but the weight of all of them together, pressing down on the comfortable assumption that we know everything that lives in the spaces we have claimed as our own. Iowa is a state of open fields and wide horizons, You can see for miles in every direction. There should be nowhere for something that large to hide, and yet the reports keep coming, the encounters keep happening, and the Dogman keeps watching from the fence line, from the tree line, from the boundary between the world we have built and the world that was there before us. The witness from Cedar Falls went on to spend decades researching the paranormal and what he called Earth mysteries. He described the encounter at Buck Ridge as life-changing, the event that set him on a path he never would have chosen if he had not heard that roar in the darkness outside his parents' house. He tried to go back to normal after that night. He finished his degree. He competed in track and field. He built a life, but the encounter sat inside him like a splinter that would not come out. Every time he drove through rural Iowa at night, every time he passed a stand of trees on the edge of a subdivision, every time the darkness beyond a porch light seemed to press a little too close, he felt it. That roar lived in his memory with a clarity that time could not soften. The deputy from Linn County never spoke publicly, never put his name on a report, never told his colleagues. He let it sit inside him like a stone. He continued working patrol. He continued driving the night corridors of the county, but he said afterward that he never looked at the dark the same way. He knew what was in it. He had seen the Dogman's face in the beam of his flashlight, and he had watched it stare back at him with an intelligence that no known animal in Iowa possesses. He kept his weapon closer after that night. He checked the tree lines more carefully. He listened harder to the sounds that came from the spaces between the streetlights. Both men were changed by what they experienced. Both men carried the knowledge that something exists in the fields and timber of Iowa that the official record does not acknowledge and that most people would not believe. And now there is footage. A dark figure standing at a fence in a flat Iowa field. A canine head turning to face the camera. A body that is too large and too wrong to be a person, and too upright and too deliberate to be a bear. The footage does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of the Cedar Falls encounter from 1981. It exists in the context of the Linn County deputy's account. It exists in the context of the 1936 Racine encounter and the 1887 Wexford County sighting and the hundreds of reports that fill the spaces between them. Each of those accounts on its own can be questioned and dismissed. Together they form a body of evidence that is harder to ignore with each new piece that gets added to the pile. The footage asks the question that the witnesses have been asking for decades. What is standing at the edge of the field? What has been watching from the tree lines and the fence rows and the dark spaces beyond the reach of our lights? And why does it keep coming back to the same places, the same boundaries, the same ancient ground that the Indigenous peoples marked as forbidden long before any of us were born? I do not have a final answer. I do not think anyone does yet. But I think the footage is real in the same way that I think the Cedar Falls encounter was real and the Linn County encounter was real. Not because any single piece of evidence is beyond question, but because the alternative, that all of this is fabrication and coincidence and mass delusion, requires a conspiracy of silence and invention so vast and so perfectly coordinated that it strains belief far more than the simple possibility that something we do not understand is living alongside us in places we thought we knew. The next time you drive through Iowa and the light gets low and the fields stretch out flat and gold toward the horizon, look at the fence lines, look at the tree lines, look at the places where the land changes from mowed grass to wild timber. If you see something standing there, something tall and dark and still, watching you with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be, do not assume it is a shadow. Do not assume it is a post or a stump or a trick of the light. Consider the possibility that it has been there longer than the fence it is leaning on. Consider the possibility that it was there before the road you are driving on was paved. Consider the possibility that the Indigenous peoples who lived on that land for thousands of years knew exactly what it was and left markers to warn others away. And consider the possibility that when the Dogman stands at the fence and watches, it is not curious about us. It is reminding us that the land remembers what we have forgotten. That there are things in this world that do not appear on any map, in any database, in any official record. things that stand at the boundaries we have drawn and look at us with eyes that glow a dull red in the fading light. Things that have been there all along. For more stories like this, consider subscribing.